let's take a closer look at some of the specific challenges and opportunities that homeschooling families face when navigating the funding landscape.
Sounds good.
So we've laid out this really complex web of different funding approaches. And I think it's important to remember that this conversation isn't just happening in a vacuum.
Mhm.
It's all tied to bigger questions about the very purpose of education.
That's a good point. Are we just focused on like test scores and college prep, or is it broader than that?
If you believe education is about personal growth, character development, maybe even career skills that aren't always measured on standardized tests, well, then stricter regulations on homeschooling might feel like they're getting in the way of that individualized approach.
And that might explain why some homeschooling families are so protective of their autonomy.
Right.
Even if it means foregoing potential funding,
Mhm.
they don't want to risk having their educational choices dictated by state mandates.
Right. They might feel like accepting public funds could turn homeschooling into something it's not, more like a mini public school with all the rules and restrictions that come with that.
But if we swing too far in the other direction,
Yeah,
prioritizing autonomy above all else,
right,
wouldn't there be concerns about quality control?
right.
How do we ensure that kids are actually getting a good education if there's no oversight?
That's a valid concern. And it's why some people argue that a certain level of accountability is necessary,
Mm-hmm.
especially when public funds are involved.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
So what are some potential solutions? How can we create a system that supports both educational choice and the accountability without sacrificing one for the other?
Some states are exploring things like tax credit scholarships,
Okay.
where individuals or businesses can directly support educational choice without the money flowing directly through government hands.
Instead of the state allocating funds to families, it's more like incentivizing private contributions to support educational options.
It's like a roundabout way of funding choice,
Mhm.
but it potentially sidesteps some of the concerns about government overreach and control.
But even with those alternative models, wouldn't there still be concerns about fairness? How do we make sure these scholarships are distributed equitably?
There are no perfect systems, and as technology evolves, we might see even more options popping up. Think about online learning platforms, educational apps, all those virtual reality tools coming out.
Whoa, are we talking like homeschooling in the metaverse?
It's not as far-fetched as it sounds.
Okay.
We might see more hybrid models, blending traditional homeschooling with these tech-driven personalized learning experiences. And that could lead to a whole new set of questions about funding and how to support these innovative approaches.
So this isn't just about understanding the current landscape of homeschool funding. It's about being ready for a future where the lines between traditional schooling and alternative education get even blurrier.
And where the definition of education itself might continue to evolve, moving towards a more personalized, flexible, and adaptable model that caters to individual needs and interests, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach.
That evolution could have a huge impact on how we think about funding.
Mhm.
If we're moving towards a more individualized system, should the money follow the student, not the institution? Should families have more control over how those funds are spent? Those are excellent questions. And as we're having these big picture discussions,
Yeah.
let's not forget about the real world impact on public schools.
Yeah.
We heard from educators in South Dakota who are worried that voucher programs could drain resources from already struggling public schools.
Right. It's like a ripple effect. Decisions about funding for one type of education inevitably have consequences for the rest of the system.
And it raises tough questions about fairness and equity.
But it sounds like the core issue here is the role of government in education. What are their responsibilities? And how do we balance those with parental rights and freedom of choice?
We're basically trying to find that sweet spot between individual liberty and collective responsibility. And that's a debate that's been going on for centuries.
It feels like we're talking about more than just dollars and cents here. It's about fundamental values and what kind of society we want to create. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the flip side. What about families who choose not to use those public funds?
You mean families who self-fund?
Yes.
Even when there are options for financial assistance.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
Some might prioritize that complete autonomy and freedom from any government involvement. Others might have philosophical or religious objections to accepting public funds.
It's like they're saying, we want the freedom to homeschool. We don't want the strings that might come attached with government funding.
Exactly. And that raises questions about fairness. If we're talking about supporting educational choice, should those families be acknowledged in some way for the tax dollars they're contributing but not utilizing?
It seems like a valid point. They're still supporting the overall system, even if they're choosing to opt out of a specific part of it.
Right. And some argue that this financial contribution deserves some recognition.
Yeah,
Maybe not direct funding, but perhaps other forms of support or incentives.
this is getting complicated. It seems like every time we peel back a layer of this homeschool funding onion, we find even more layers underneath.
It is complex, but that's what makes it so fascinating to explore. And speaking of exploring, our research led us to some data from the Mountain States Policy Center, which adds another dimension to this whole discussion.
What did they find?
They actually quantified the savings that private and homeschooling families provide to taxpayers. They looked at Idaho, Washington, Montana, and Wyoming, comparing public education spending to private school and homeschooling enrollment numbers.
So instead of focusing on the cost of educational choice, they're flipping the script and looking at the potential savings.
And the results are pretty eye-opening. In Idaho, for example, they estimated that private and homeschooling families have saved the state over $2 billion over the past decade, almost as much as the entire state's K-12 budget.
That's a significant amount of money. It seems like we often focus on the cost of alternatives without acknowledging the potential savings.
Right. And it underscores the importance of considering multiple perspectives and carefully weighing the costs and benefits before making decisions about funding.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the human side of this debate.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the policy wonkery and the statistics, but at the end of the day, this is about real families making real choices about their children's education.
We need to remember that behind these numbers are parents who are deeply invested in their children's education and who are making sacrifices to provide them with the best possible learning experience.
And I think that's a great perspective to keep in mind as we move into the final part of this deep dive. We've explored the arguments, the data, the legal precedents, but ultimately it's about creating a system that works for families and puts the needs of students first.
Well said. So as we wrap up this segment, I encourage everyone listening to think about those families, the challenges they face, the sacrifices they make, and their unwavering commitment to their children's education. Because those are the voices that should guide us as we navigate this complex world of homeschool funding and strive to create a system that truly empowers families and supports educational excellence for all.
So big picture,
Yeah.
we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the philosophical debates about the role of government in education to the nitty-gritty details of different funding mechanisms. It's a lot to process.
It really is. But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
the decisions you make about your child's education are deeply personal. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and that includes funding.
So what's the takeaway for families listening who are thinking about homeschooling or already on that journey? Where do they even begin to sort through all this information?
The key is to be informed. Do your research, understand the laws and regulations in your specific state. Don't just assume what's happening in Nevada or South Carolina applies to you.
Each state is its own little universe when it comes to homeschooling regulations and funding.
And don't be afraid to reach out to other homeschooling families.
Yeah.
Local support groups, even online forums, they can offer a wealth of practical advice and resources.
It's like having a network of homeschooling veterans to guide you through the maze.
They've been there, done that, and can share what worked for them.
Yeah.
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. It sparked a conversation, raised important questions, but the exploration doesn't stop here.
Whether you're a seasoned homeschooler or just starting to explore your options, we hope this conversation has given you some valuable insights and food for thought.